I frequently marvel at how crafty our ancestors were. I mean, I'm talking about the sages who wrote the Talmud, who gave interpretations of the Bible, and this morning, particularly the ones who somehow put together the Torah and Haftorah readings that we read every year. Now, when I say crafty, I don't mean that in a mean-spirited way. I mean, they were carefully crafted how this was done. They took a lot of care and thought and intention in determining how to set up the calendar and how to set up the Torah readings. And it's on Torah portions like the one we read this morning that I'm just marveling at their craftiness. Okay, maybe they were a little bit sneaky, but the main thing is they thought about this very, very carefully, I think. And as I was sitting to read the Torah portion this morning, getting ready for Shavuot this evening, it occurred to me that this was done intentionally. But in order to understand it, let's go back to what we're doing in the book of Numbers. So the book of Numbers opens on the first day of the second month of Iyar, in the second year following the Exodus. So it's basically 1 year and 1 month since they first set aside a Passover lamb to sacrifice, right? They took the lamb on the first day of the first month. On the 14th day of the month, they had the Passover Seder, right? And so now we're in the second month of the second year. It's about 13 months after the Exodus from Egypt. By the first day of the third month, they were standing at Mount Sinai, which is why tonight we're going to be receiving the Ten Commandments. They stayed at Sinai getting more laws and set up the tabernacle on the first day of Nisan, exactly 1 year after they set aside the lamb. And then apparently they stayed there an extra month at Mount Sinai before taking the census that we start reading this morning. As I mentioned before, they're taking a census because they're preparing to conquer the land of Israel, and they need to know how many soldiers they have. And each person has a very specific position in the encampment of the soldiers. And that's how we get the book of Numbers. So it's right before Shavuot. And this portion is always read, as I said, the Shabbat before Shavuot. And it's also interesting that the book of Deuteronomy begins. It's the first portion of Deuteronomy is read right before Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the month of Av, which commemorates the destruction of the first and second temple. Every year we read the first Torah portion of Devarim right before Tisha B'Av, and Ve'etchanan, which includes the Ten Commandments, is always read immediately after Tisha B'Av. In the case of Devarim, the entire book is a collection of admonitions to the Israelites, warning them to follow God's laws, or else a calamity will ensue. And sure enough, by ironic coincidence in the calendar, right after we read those warnings, we commemorate the calamities that occurred with the destruction of the first and second temple. And then we read again the story of the giving of the Ten Commandments as if to say we're renewing the covenant with God after the calamity occurred. In today's Torah portion, we're counting soldiers and therefore symbolically linking it to the counting of days before the giving of the Ten Commandments. Today is the 49th day of the Omer. We've been counting 49 days. Now we're counting soldiers. In fulfilling God's command to us as a people, every day counts. That's what we learn from counting the Omer. Every single day counts. And in the Torah portion we read this morning, every person counts. Every day is a new day, a new beginning, a new opportunity to get it right. And every person must do his or her part for society as a whole. If we see someone faltering, we must help that person to get back up and try again. Gently instruct them to do better next time, to try and correct their errors. And we can each be an example to others by the actions that we do ourselves. Counting the Omer teaches us that every day counts, and the book of Numbers teaches us that every person counts. This Torah portion is also significant that it begins the break between God's stupendously miraculous intervention into our history and the world that we recognize, where such miracles are not part of our world. In Egypt, there were 10 plagues that increased in magnitude and grandeur, culminating in the destruction of the most powerful army in the world in the Red Sea, followed by the ruthless assault of the Amalekites that was incredibly halted by the recently freed slaves when Moses literally held up his hands. And of course, there was the overwhelming experience of God's presence at Sinai. And during this time, there's water to drink and manna to eat provided from dry rocks and barren soil. But now, at the beginning of the book of Numbers, it would seem the Israelites are going to have to fight their own battles, literally, mostly on their own, hence the need to organize an army. Of course, as we will read in the rest of the book of Numbers, the Israelites will prove unprepared for this task. They will continue to whine about water and food. They will succumb to demagogues like Korach, Datan, and Aviram. They will fear the conquest, and when the spies are sent out to conquer the land, they will be terrified by the report that the inhabitants are giants and that the cities are well fortified. But the result is not going to be further spectacular intervention by God. He's not going to say, go and fight anyway, and I'll make miracles happen so you'll be victorious. Instead, God says to them, you're obviously not ready to take control of your destiny. Maybe your children will be. And the generation of the Exodus will be condemned to die in the wilderness. Their children will have to accept the challenge of the conquest, and Joshua, rather than Moses, will lead them into battle. From that time until today, we have been charged with the responsibility for our own destiny. We may end up being fortunate in our endeavors. We may get lucky breaks that could be merely serendipitous or maybe divinely guided. But in either case, we must be the catalysts that set the course for our own future. So as we approach Shavuot this evening, let us renew our covenant with God, taking responsibility for our own destiny by counting each day and taking note of each and every person in our community, because each day counts and every person counts, and we need to work together to build a better future. Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach.